Until the arrival of dedicated steam-powered haulage, goods were transported by rail, water, or in trailers towed behind traction engines. With the relaxation of previously stringent legislation, the use of steam-powered lorries and wagons on roads flourished in the early 20th century. The steam road vehicle's roots can be traced to 1759, when a Frenchman invented a crude gun tractor for military use. But it was almost a century later, in 1849, that the farmer's friend, consisting of a traction engine pulling a trailer, became the first steam-powered vehicle dedicated to the transportation of goods. For the next 40 years, a variety of steam lorries were produced by different companies across the UK to service local needs. But it was only when the 1865 Red Flag Act, which required someone to walk in front of all mechanically propelled vehicles, was fully repealed in 1896, that road transportation really leapt forward. The steam lorry had come of age, and by the turn of the 20th century, lorries had a rigid chassis with the boiler, body and engine attached to the frame. Steam lorries and wagons were manufactured by 120 companies in their heyday, and the majority of these were produced by British manufacturers. But only a handful of firms actually specialised in manufacturing steam lorries and wagons. They were manufactured in two basic forms, the overtype and the undertype, with the main distinction being the position of the engine in relation to the boiler. The undertype designs, such as Sentinels, have the engine mounted under the chassis with the usually vertical type boiler in the vehicle cab. Undertypes are generally more akin to conventional lorries with fully enclosed cabs, whereas the overtypes, such as Foden's, resemble hybrid traction engines with the cab built around a horizontal boiler and a round smoke box and chimney at the front. Power transmissions were usually chain-driven, but later models produced by MAN, Sentinel, Foden and Yorkshire were shaft-driven, meaning models like the Sentinel S4 could achieve impressive speeds of up to 60 miles per hour, whereas the equivalent petrol lorry of the time could reach a top speed of just 35 miles per hour. Able to carry a multitude of loads, steam lorries and wagons dominated road haulage during the early part of the 1900s and were used in large numbers throughout the First World War. But during the 20s and early 30s, steam road haulage declined as more and more restrictions were placed upon road steam haulage, with government legislation introduced for speed, smoke and vapour limits. Operating costs skyrocketed further when a wetted tax, based on the size of the wetted area of a boiler, resulted in the road fund licence for steam-propelled lorries escalating dramatically. Increases in the taxation rate for steam lorries based on axle weight in the Road Traffic Act of 1933 were the last straw. The steam lorry had literally reached the end of the road. A small number of steam lorries and wagons remained working until the end of the 60s. A few were put to agricultural use, and some were converted into tar sprayers, which were exempt from road tax, but most were lost to scrap. Between 1931 and 1936 alone, 5,000 older steam lorries were scrapped. Steam lorries and wagons are today rare but popular vehicles among enthusiasts and owners, who lovingly strive to preserve an important part of our heritage. A regular sight at road runs and steam shows held throughout the country. The Fairford Steam Rally, held each August in Gloucestershire, plays host to a wonderful selection of steam vehicles, including steam lorries and wagons. Although the largest display by far is to be found at the annual Great Dorset Steam Fair. One of the last steam wagons produced in the UK by the Sentinel Wagon Company was this Sentinel S4, number 9192 off the production line. Supplied new to the Tottenham District Gasworks as a coke wagon in 1935, this Super Sentinel S4 worked throughout the Second World War and beyond. Entering preservation in the 1950s, the wagon had 4 owners prior to being acquired in 1994 by its current owner. Sentinel, then known as Alley & McLellan, started around 1875 as an engineering company originally based at the Sentinel Works in Glasgow. They produced their first steam road vehicle in 1906 and 9 years later moved their steam wagon production to Shrewsbury, Shropshire, forming Sentinel Wagon Works Limited. With just a few modifications, the original Alley & McLellan model remained in production until the introduction of the Sentinel Super in 1923. 11 years later, Sentinel launched an advanced steamer, the S or shaft drive type. Lighter and more modern, the S was available in 4, 6 and 8-wheel variants. Whilst pretty much original, this Sentinel was completely worn out when purchased by Geoffrey Peach. Almost every part of the wagon needed attention. The only component not requiring restoration was the back axle. During the complete strip down and rebuild, which took 3.5 years, all of the boiler fittings were totally overhauled, and the boiler had a new firebox, as well as work to the outer boiler body. Operated by a 2-man crew consisting of a driver and fireman, unlike a diesel engine, there's no electronic ignition. Instead, there's a lighting up procedure, which takes time to build up steam. Two things must be checked before lighting up. The fireman inspects the sight glass to ensure there's enough water in the boiler. He also checks that the cover has been removed from the chimney, otherwise the cab fills with smoke. Next, the fireman lifts the top off the boiler and opens the grate to let air in. Using a shovel, a piece of rag and paraffin, the fireman places the shovel on top of the boiler. He then carefully pours paraffin onto the rag before lighting the fuel-soaked rag. And once certain that it's well alight, places the rag down the small hole in the boiler, taking care not to burn his eyebrows in the process. With the fire started, the fireman puts as much wood as possible into the boiler. Dry, clean kindling wood is best to get the fire going quickly. The lid is then placed back on the boiler to let the wood take for about 5 minutes. And then, as soon as the woods are light, coal is added from one of the 2 bunkers located behind the seats. 2 or 3 shovels full of coal are enough to start the fire, and about an hour later, sufficient steam, about 200 pounds per square inch, will have built up to move the wagon. The engine is then left to warm through whilst the crew coal up, water up, and carry out the safety checks. When the fireman is happy with the boiler, the wagon is ready for the road. As part of the long restoration process for this Sentinel, the engine was stripped down and overhauled. A massive amount of work was needed, including casting new cylinder blocks and new cylinder heads, replacing the gears, and regrinding all the journals, which were also remetalled. The crank was the only part to avoid repair. Steam lorries and wagons don't change gear in the conventional way. The middle lever, called the valve events reversing lever, goes right forward, then intermediate, then fast forward. The position the lever's shown in is drain, which holds all the valves open on the engine to cut down on condensation being trapped inside the engine overnight. Fast forward is used to warm the engine up by blowing steam through the engine initially to get the chill off it. The position furthest back is reverse. There's no gear change to get reverse. There's no clutch, it's direct drive, so the driver just selects the gear they want. Normally when moving around yards, the driver would use a low gear, but generally the driver sets the engine to high gear immediately. The lever on the side of the driver's seat is a drain to enable the removal of steam condensation out of the exhaust line without blowing it out of the chimney. Behind the driver's seat, next to the water tank, is a bypass valve for the water feed to the boiler. Steam from the boiler is combined with cold water, which increases the velocity and overcomes boiler pressure as it goes into the boiler. This Sentinel is an under-type steam wagon with the 4-cylinder poppet valve engine, which is virtually identical to a sideways mounted diesel engine located underneath the frame of the wagon. With a long history of being displayed at events, including the first ever Great Dorset Steam Fair in 1968, this S4 is still regularly displayed at rallies across the country. Roading between rallies, the S4 has an average speed of between 35 and 40 miles an hour, give or take the water stops every 100 miles to refill the 2 onboard 50-gallon water tanks located beneath the coal bunkers and the extra tank on the flatbed. This 1929 6-ton C-Class Foden steam tipper wagon was altered soon after manufacture. Built by Foden's Limited at Elmworth Works in Sandbach, Cheshire, this wagon was converted into a winch tractor by T.T. Borton & Son of Amersham, Buckinghamshire in the 1930s. Changes to the Road Traffic Act had made steam wagons uneconomic for road haulage use after 1933. Foden's was started by Edwin Foden, who in 1876 took over the company he'd joined as a 15-year-old apprentice 20 years previously. Edwin Foden & Son produced a range of agricultural and industrial machinery, including stationary steam engines. Later, the firm moved into agricultural engines and, by the turn of the century, road engines. Another restructure and name change to Foden's Limited followed in 1902, by which time the company had developed a reputation for quality engineering. Used by Bortons for winching and hauling timber from the 1930s well into the 1950s, Samantha is a fine example of a winch tractor conversion. Samantha, works number 13454, is fitted with a Sea King's marine engine to drive the winch. The Foden C-type dates from 1919 and incorporates all the good points of the earlier 5-ton wagon with further improvements. Various C-type versions were available to order, including wagon body, articulated, timber tractor and road tractor. Both the 5 and 6-ton Foden wagons were produced with solid tyres, although some were converted to pneumatics following the Road Traffic Act changes. Improvements to the 6-ton wagon included Ackerman steering, the use of roller bearings for the crankshaft and eccentrics, an enclosed cab for the driver and fireman, and the optional extra of a windscreen. A third gear was also added to the C-type. Acquired by the late David Hurst and extensively restored, Samantha is now part of the Hurst family collection. With a long history in preservation, the Foden winch tractor was displayed at rallies in the livery of G.J. Lynch of Barnstaple, Devon, as early as 1971. Nowadays, Samantha is a popular exhibit at the Great Dorset Steam Fair, as well as other rallies and road runs in the south. The boiler is a horizontal multi-tubular type and forms the front part of the framework. Fired with coke, coal or wood, the boiler is reputed to be the easiest steam maker of any boiler on any steam wagon, but the tubes must be carefully cleaned before firing up each time. The compound engine could work as a compound for normal running on the road or simple for starting off and shunting trailers. With 2 cylinders, one is a 4-inch diameter patented high-pressure cylinder and the other a 6 3/4-inch low-pressure cylinder. The steam is exhausted from the high-pressure cylinder into the low-pressure cylinder, which needs to be larger to produce the same power as the high-pressure smaller cylinder. The Foden cylinder block is famous for using long valves, which enable steam to enter the cylinder directly through short straight ports. In the days when steam wagons were prevalent, there were few other mechanised vehicles on the byways and highways. But today, competing with fast-moving traffic on crowded roads, driving vehicles with top speeds of just 10 or maybe 20 miles an hour is not for the faint-hearted. Other than a standard driving license, no formal qualifications are needed to drive most steam engines and wagons. So, as well as expertly driving and steaming their vehicles, crews need to be aware of the other road users who can often create danger through their impatience. The National Traction Engines Trust, the main organisation for owners, has set up comprehensive training schemes to improve levels of competence and deliver high standards of operation by steam vehicle owners when travelling on the roads. This Super Sentinel 6-ton steam wagon, works number 7651, was built in Shrewsbury, Shropshire in 1928 for the Cambridge University and Town Gas Light Company. The wagon delivered coke for the firm until the 1950s, when the engine was scrapped, quite possibly as a casualty of the creation of statutory regional gas boards in 1950. In the 1960s, however, the wagon was purchased for preservation and passed through 4 or 5 different owners, but was never fully restored until acquired by Mark Johnson in 1997. On the surface at the time of purchase, the wagon didn't look too bad, but as the strip down on the Sentinel started, the overall condition was revealed to be very poor, turning a loving restoration into a full rebuild, including the installation of a completely new boiler which can be seen beneath the front of the wagon. Following a day in steam, the black ash pan below the boiler is cleaned out first. Then the fire grate is cleaned and the fire set. After 3 or 4 rallies, the washout plugs in the bottom of the boiler are dropped and the boiler is washed out completely to help prolong the life of the boiler by removing any lime buildup caused by hard water. At rallies, the Super Sentinel's team spent hours devotedly polishing every detail on this steam wagon and taking care of minor bits of general maintenance. They have a policy of trying to keep the engine as clean and tidy as possible, despite roading the Sentinel to events all over the country. When not on the road or attending rallies, a good 12 to 15 hours every week are spent keeping the Super Sentinel in what can only be described without exaggeration as pristine condition. This Sentinel was originally a 3-way tipper which was fitted with a water-injected 3-foot ram, but this proved too costly to restore. There are 2 sets of lights, the lower dynamo-driven electric lights and the removable original oil lights that hang on the cab body. This Super Sentinel's vertical boiler in the middle of the cab has horizontal tubes for the water, with the fire heating the outside of the tubes. The water gauge indicates how much water is in the boiler, and the pressure gauge is attached to the side of the body. The black box between the boiler and the pressure gauge is the water feed heater. Here, when the wagon's moving, water is preheated by exhaust steam before entering the boiler to help with the steaming process. On the top of the boiler, there's a vertical chute for coal, instead of a coal-in stoke at the bottom as on other makes. The upright safety valve, located just in front of the steering wheel, is one of the most important features, as it releases excess pressure into the boiler to prevent explosions. This Sentinel travels over 1,000 miles a year at speeds of 20 to 30 miles an hour, but braking can be a challenge. At just 20 miles an hour, the 6-ton wagon has a stopping distance of 25 feet using the original steam brakes, which have to be kept warm by depressing the foot brake pedal regularly. Chain-driven, the Super Sentinel is a little unusual as it has 2 chains. On the very early standard Sentinels, a conventional differential was used on the back axle and there was only 1 chain. But after that, Sentinels always housed the differential in the hollow crankshaft through the journals. Sentinel's designs for boilers and engines were different to other manufacturers, but also the company mounted the engine underneath the chassis, providing more payload space due to the shorter cab area. Because the engine was located so far away from the boiler, Sentinel developed a superheater for the engine. A throttle box mounted in the cab carries a steam supply pipe from the 70-foot-long superheater coil to superheat the engine. The throttle box also carries the lubrication oil down the main supply pipe to lubricate the cylinders. This Foden steam bus, works number 4258 and known as Irene, was built in 1914 as a steam lorry, with the bus body added later as part of a rebuild. Purchased in 2000 in a derelict condition by Alan Painter, the bus has been fully restored and painted in the livery of the Midland Bus Company. Steam-powered vehicles designed for carrying passengers were in operation in British cities as early as the 1830s. Known as steam carriages, they proved very popular, but progress was thwarted when heavy road tolls for steam vehicles were imposed under the Turnpike Act. In 1861, restrictive speed limits for steam vehicles were introduced. Speeds were lowered further to 4 miles per hour in the country and just 2 miles per hour in towns and cities in 1865. The Red Flag Act and other restrictions forced mechanically propelled vehicles off the roads completely. It was only when the Red Flag Act was repealed in 1896 that steam-propelled vehicles finally returned to the roads. Steam buses, manufactured by De Dion, were transporting passengers across London by 1898, but they did not prove popular and disappeared entirely by the turn of the century. Following a revival in 1909, there were 184 steam buses running in London by 1914, but they'd all been withdrawn by 1919. There was another, albeit brief, resurgence in the 1920s when Foden, along with Sentinel and MAN, experimented with one-off steam buses. But steam-powered buses disappeared for good very soon afterwards. This Foden 5-ton HH wagon is today slightly less common than the Foden 6-ton steam lorry, and yet far more 5-ton models were actually produced. At the start of the First World War, the War Department commandeered the entire output of the Foden 5-ton overtype wagons. For use by the British Army, the 5-tonners left Foden's Cheshire factory for France, quite literally by the trainload. After the war, many of the steam lorries returned to the UK to be sold off as surplus. Jesse Walron, one of steam preservation's early pioneers, purchased this Foden in 1971 at a sale. Originally a tipper which was sold to Swindon Borough Council for general haulage, works number 13752 dates from 1930. Although the full history is not known, the tipper underwent conversion early on and ended its working life as a tar sprayer with W.J. King of Bishop's Lydiard. In a very poor condition when first acquired by Jesse, it was 4 years until the wagon was ready for steaming up. Some work was still needed, but the boiler was safe and operational. The boiler on any steam vehicle is a major responsibility for all owners and has to be inspected annually. A cold inspection is followed a few weeks later by the hot test, after which a boiler certificate is issued. Since the introduction of strict boiler regulations, boiler explosions fortunately seem to be a thing of the past. Now in excellent condition, Jesse describes the maintenance of Reliance as ongoing since he first started the restoration process. Painted in the livery of the Cottage Brewing Company, the Foden is a later model, so has a windscreen which, although good for protection against the weather, holds the noise in when driving on roads. The first thing to be done when shutting the steam lorry down for the night is to ensure that there's not too much fire and to close the damper down so that it stops drawing the fire. It's also essential to make sure that there's always plenty of water in the boiler, because it still keeps dissipating due to the heat, even after the fire has gone out. This Yorkshire Patent Steam Wagon Company's WG four-wheeled steam lorry, works number 2108, was built in 1927 and delivered new to Clayton Son & Company Limited of Moor Works, Hunslet, Leeds in the north of England. Equipped with a tank and steam-operated pump, the wagon was under contract to the council in Leeds as a gully sucker. The 6-ton vehicle was returned to works and rebuilt in 1936. The work undertaken included replacing the solid wheels with pneumatic tyres and the chain drive with a shaft. The name Yorkshire Lad was given to the wagon by the previous owner, who named all his vehicles. Despite going through a repaint, the Wines family decided to keep the livery, with the exception of changing the owner's name and location. Sold at auction in 1984 to the scrap merchants Hardwicks of Ewell, Surrey, this Yorkshire steam wagon was acquired by the late Mervyn Wines and is now cared for by Philip Wines and his family. Little more is known about this vehicle's history until it was rebuilt from a very derelict state by W. Fernley of Castleford, Yorkshire in the early 1950s, when the original tank and steam pump were replaced with a flatbed during restoration. This particular model is the only one of its type still in existence, and there are 7 Yorkshire patent steam wagons left in the world, 3 in the UK, 2 in New Zealand and 1 in Australia. During the display season, Philip Wines and his team polish the brass and copper every day because dampness through the night can quickly tarnish the metalwork. Over the winter period, Yorkshire Lad is stripped down for more in-depth maintenance and repairs to wear and tear prior to the annual boiler inspection at the beginning of each year. Yorkshire patent steam wagons were produced between 1901 and 1937. From the start, the firm produced steam wagons with a unique horizontal double-ended boiler placed transversely across the frame. Yorkshire Lad's boiler is shaped like a T. The boiler has very short tubes of just 12 to 17 inches either side, with the firebox in the middle. The heat comes out through the bottom set of tubes, back up the outside, and through the top of the tubes before exiting through the chimney. The S-shaped tubes are the superheater tubes, and there's one set on either side. The water injector is located on the stokerman's side and is used to inject the water into the boiler when needed. But the sight gauge for the water levels is on the driver's side, so is the oil pressure, a pressure gauge for steam, and a pressure gauge for the air-assisted brakes, which are controlled by the foot brake. The Yorkshire's engine, with high and low pressure cylinders, is located inside the cab, between the driver and fireman. Just in front of the engine is the regulator. The 2-speed gearbox, plus a transfer box which is located under the flatbed, gives the vehicle an additional higher gear, enabling Yorkshire Lad to travel at 30 miles an hour on the road. Just to the right of the driver's seat is the forward and reverse lever, with neutral in the middle, with the handbrake located on the steering column. The Yorkshire needs a 2-man crew for operation, but the driver opens the fire by pulling the chain whilst coal, stored under the fireman's seat, is dispensed through a hole to the right of the bunker. Today, Yorkshire Lad is fitted with electric headlights, side lights and rear lights powered through an alternator, but originally the vehicle had fuel or gas lights. The water tank, located at the rear under the flatbed, carries between 300 and 400 gallons of water, enabling the wagon to run for 35 miles between water stops. When roading, the wagon carries an additional 200-gallon water tank on the flatbed. Yorkshire Lad has rod brakes consisting of a foot brake and a hand brake. With only steam brakes originally, a compressor has been added to provide assisted air brakes. Between 1972 and 1974, Jim Calder built this steam-powered light delivery baker's van. Following the abolition of the Red Flag Act in 1896, a number of steam engine manufacturers created light, fast delivery vans. Paraffin-fired one-man steam wagons were introduced in London shortly afterwards. Jim Calder saw some pictures of these, and upon finding a horse-drawn baker's van lying in a field, he decided to build a van similar to those manufactured at the turn of the 20th century. Working with just a few very basic drawings and a lot of ingenuity, with a variety of old parts, the hybrid Hovis vehicle was born. Within the driver area is the crankshaft and a chain drive, which goes down to the running axles that came originally from a Ford 10 car. A gearbox helps make the van easier to drive, and there are 4 gears, forward and reverse. Steam is supplied from a vertical fire tube boiler tested and insured to a working pressure of 300 pounds per square inch, although only used up to 200 psi. The van is fired by a Loon Valley vaporizing burner, which is a bit like a glorified blow lamp and is fed by paraffin at a pressure of 20 psi. The pressure gauges and foot pedal are located on the driver's side of the boiler. There's also a motorcycle odometer, which is required because the steam van incorporates a Ford 10 chassis and is therefore classed as a Ford 10 car, so the vehicle has to pass an annual MOT. This is certainly most unusual for a steam engine. Power is supplied by a Locomobile steam car engine dating from 1900. This is a twin-cylinder, double-acting, simple expansion engine fed by flat side valves, operated by Stephenson's link motion, and is fully reversible. With a running speed of 20 miles per hour, the vehicle is known affectionately as the bread bin, due to the fact that the van incorporates the horse-drawn body built originally for Hovis in around 1902. Built at the Sentinel works in 1930, the 6-ton Super Sentinel wagon, with works number 8393, was sold for £692 to W.M. Brown & Company of Ipswich and used for transporting flour. In 1933, this 8-foot wide steam wagon went to the Sentinel works to have the acetylene lighting replaced by a 12-volt electrical system and the solid rubber tyres changed to pneumatics. The Sentinel then returned to hauling sacks of flour until 1937. A year later, the Super Sentinel was sold on and transported gravel until being abandoned for the duration of the Second World War. It seemed that the Super Sentinel was destined for destruction when the wagon was acquired by the scrap merchants J.W. Hardwick and Sons of Ewell in Surrey in 1953. But fate intervened. Thanks to the Suez Crisis of 1956, the wagon was granted a reprieve when purchased by Wingham Engineering Company Limited and prepared for service. With the crisis over, the wagon was sent on permanent loan to HMS Sultan in 1960, where the naval apprentices completely refitted, restored and repainted the 23 feet long steam wagon. A decade later, the Royal Navy acquired the 2-cylinder Super Sentinel wagon for £1,250. Today, the steamer is still maintained and run by a volunteer crew of Royal Navy service personnel, ex-service personnel and civilians, and is based at the Royal Navy's School of Marine Engineering, HMS Sultan, in Gosport, Hampshire. This is believed to be the only 3-ton Foden steam wagon in existence. Originally commissioned as part of a trial order for Boots the Chemist, the vehicle, with works number 3398, was exhibited at the Smithfield Show in Nottingham in 1912 with a canvas body. Following the show, the vehicle returned to Foden's and a rigid body was added. The wagon was scrapped in 1928 and only the engine and boiler survived. The famous model engineer Bill Jakes used the flywheel to power his workshop tools until in 1970 Jack Crabtree bought the engine and boiler. He found the running gear, tank, axles and other bits and rebuilt the Foden over 5 years. Looking more like a traction engine when the Calder family acquired the wagon in 1992, they've since added a new cab and motion covers and painted the steam lorry in the family livery. This wagon is driven by chain steering consisting of a worm and 2 chains wrapped around a central spindle which controls the front axle. It's not without difficulty though. If the wagon hits a pothole or sunken drain, it's easy to lose control of the steering wheel. The fireman normally operates the levers and regulator and the steersman drives, but with Foden's, the driver controls both and the fireman focuses on managing the fire and water for the standard Foden horizontal boiler. The driver's position is slightly unorthodox, with only one leg inside the vehicle, and the early Fodens were open and without windscreens too. The small convex bonnet was changed on later models following complaints by drivers that they could not see traffic. On this early model, it's essential that the driver manages the engine carefully because the driver cannot change gear on the move. If the vehicle runs out of gear on a hill, the driver has to stop, put the chock under the wheel, change gear and then set off again. The motion is open and when on the road, the vehicle has to be oiled up every 2 hours. Factoring in regular oil and water stops, the average 20 miles per hour speed drops to just 10 miles an hour over the course of a day. The Foden is steamed to events around the country, covering about 600 miles each year. One of the few modifications to help with operating a vehicle over 100 years old in modern traffic is the steam assistance for the brakes. Fitted with pneumatic tyres, the Foden originally had solid tyres with wooden bally wheels, as at the time rubber tyres were a third of the cost of the vehicle. The Calder family planned to restore the original 1912 details, including the canvas body, as soon as time permits. This Super Sentinel DG4, standing for double gear 4-wheel, 3-way tipping van with works number 6979 was delivered new in June 1927 to G. Franklin & Sons of St Pancras, London for coke and coal delivery. Returned to Sentinel works in 1935, the wagon was fitted with pneumatic tyres, a front windscreen and a dynamo, driven by a belt which is attached to the engine to provide power for the lights. Redundant for a couple of years before entering preservation, the Super Sentinel then changed hands several times before being purchased by Jim Hutchins of Dorset. Joseph Warren, a founder member of the West of England Steam Engine Club, bought the Super Sentinel in 1961, but sold it again 7 years later. The vehicle's next documented change of ownership was in June 1990, when extensive steam vehicle collector Derek Granston undertook a full restoration. The wagon was painted in a livery representing his design and build construction company E.C. Granston. After taking part in a road run between John O'Groats and Land's End in May 1999, the Super Sentinel was sold on to Tony Slingsby in 2000. Then in August 2008, Chris Vincent purchased the wagon. By pure coincidence, Dennis Warren, Chris Vincent's father-in-law, already knew the vehicle. Dennis had fired the wagon for his father, Joseph Warren, in the 60s. When Chris's eldest son Joseph saw the Super Sentinel for the first time, he christened it Elizabeth, after the Thomas the Tank Engine character. The DG4 was initially introduced by Sentinel in 1926, and this particular example remains in its original factory-produced form, with an hydraulic 3-way tipping body. Most tippers were converted into flatbeds or survived for display purposes only, but this 10-foot-high Super Sentinel's tipper body is in full working order. The 3-way tipper is operated by a ram and pivots on a ball with lockable pins for the 3 angles. If, for example, the load needs to tip to the left, some pins are pulled out on the left-hand side and also at the back left-hand corner, and once the sideboard has been dropped, the tipper is operated. The tipper cannot currently be used as the rear now has fixed seats with seat belts to enable the large family to go on road runs together. Sentinel produced the best-selling steam wagon and, along with Foden, dominated the market until the 1930s. But by 1937, Sentinel's steam wagon production had more or less ceased. The company managed to survive the steam wagon downturn by producing diesel lorries, which were not much different in appearance to the Sentinel steam wagons. But it was not the end of Sentinel's steam wagon production. In 1950, the company produced a batch of 100 kit-form Sentinel S-type steam wagons for the Rio Turbio coal mine in Argentina, although it's been claimed that Sentinel were paid for only half of the last batch of wagons. Between 1906 and 1951, Sentinel steam wagons were produced and shipped all around the world. This Foden 6-wheel 12-ton Type K3 tractor named Valiant is the only one of its kind being rallied. This heavy hauler with works number 13008 was built in 1928 as a wagon for Bethels of Surrey and was later converted into a tar sprayer for the Liverpool Lake and Trinidad Asphalt Company. More recently, the wagon was rebuilt into a 12-ton tractor by Edward Benton of Worthing and is now part of the Saunders Steam Collection. Built in 1929, this 5-ton Foden steam wagon has been fitted with a 1901 box van body, but had originally ex-works a tipper body. One of the last two chain steering lorries built by Foden, works number 13264, was sold to the West Riding of Yorkshire Passenger Transport Executive. The tipper was then sold for scrap in 1939, but was later rescued by Sandy Steel and rallied using the identity of a D-type tractor, works number 13042. This HH model, known as Margaret, was sold around 1969 to Tom Forrest of Stirling, and then snapped up by Brickwoods Brewery in Hampshire, where its works number changed again, this time to TP9530. When the brewery was taken over by Whitbreads in the mid-70s, the wagon was sold to the Penrith Steam Museum. A regular on the Southern England rally scene since current owner Gareth Jones purchased Margaret in 1994, the wagon underwent a full restoration in 1996. Despite springs and a differential, the Foden provides a fairly hard ride. Speed needs to be kept down because with solid wheels, speeds over 25 miles an hour could cause the rims, which are only pressed on the steel wheels, to get too hot and slip off. Displayed here is the Sentinel S4 wagon with works number 9074, and alongside is the very next wagon off the production line, number 9075. Remarkably, both vehicles survived into preservation despite very different histories. They were supplied new as a pair with matching trailers on the 8th of May 1934 to Brown & Son Limited, timber and builders merchants of Chelmsford in Essex. Registered as BEV 467 and BEV 466, the pair worked extensively in the Chelmsford area, though by December 1939 the pair were in the ownership of the Castle Firebrick Company, operating from their works in Flintshire, North Wales. The twosome parted company in 1956 when 9074 was sold to a road tarring contractor in Shrewsbury, Shropshire. Having last steamed in 1963, 9074 then entered preservation, passing through a number of enthusiasts before ending up in 1976 in a dismantled state with Roger Hickman. Major boiler repairs and an engine overhaul were carried out by the late Ted Proctor, and the wagon was subsequently named Proctor's Pride in his memory. Sold again in 93 and 1998, Jim Sarney purchased the S4 in 2003 before passing the wagon on to Richard Hazel, who repainted the Sentinel in the current livery. 9075 was considered to be beyond restoration at the time of purchase by Arnold Brock and David Hurst from Fernley's in Castleford in the early 1960s. Some years later, the S4 wagon restoration was complete and the Sentinel was given the name Homevalian after Holmfirth in West Yorkshire, where the owners lived. 9075 started to be rallied in a very distinctive orange livery from 1968. This S4 took part in the Land's End to John O'Groat's run in 1976 and was sold on 2 years later to Douglas White, who rebuilt the vehicle over the next 5 years before passing the Sentinel to the present owners, Paul and Kay Jewell, in 1993. The wagon was then restored and given her original Brown & Sons livery and has been a regular at fairs and rallies ever since. This Foden C-type wagon, with works number 13316, was built in 1929 and spent its working life as a tar sprayer with tar roads of London, before moving to northern tar roads in Kendal in Cumbria prior to entering preservation in 1963. Initially, the tar tank was removed and replaced with a ballast box, but when the wagon was sold to Horrell Brothers in Devon during the late 1960s, they replaced the box body with a tank and painted the vehicle in their Horrell cider livery. This Foden has the shortened locomotive pistol-type boiler with a steaming capacity that does not leave much reserve, unlike agricultural engines. Designed to provide a large heating surface to evaporate as much water as possible, the fireman had to continually tend the fire, balancing steam demand with road conditions. Sir Lionel was purchased by the Dovey family in 2001, and since then the overtype steam lorry has undergone extensive boiler work and the fitting of window frames, in keeping with the original design. The vehicle also underwent a full repaint in the livery of New Forest cider. The final refinements to the Foden steam wagon prior to its demise were the pneumatic tyres. Some wagons were also fitted with large 16-tooth drive chain sprockets. These changes improved speed, but Fodens were never as fast as Sentinels. Indeed, drivers knocked the Foden engines out of gear downhill to reach speeds of 40 miles an hour. Island Chief is a fine example of a works-built early Foden D-type timber tractor, dating from 1926, and supplied new to Arthur Kirby of Newton Abbot Sawmills to pull timber out of woods and take it to the sawmills. The 6-ton tractor with works number 12370 then passed through a succession of owners, including P. Harris & Son, the fairground owners, where this Foden was used to operate their Chair-a-Plane ride. Richard Lucas's family purchased Island Chief in 1996, and although running, the tractor was in a very poor state, taking 6 years for the initial restoration. Work still continues to this day, with the family focusing on one section of the engine for extensive work each winter. Most recently, this was the restoration and repair of the entire front axle, including replacement of a cracked spring. There are also regular maintenance tasks, such as small adjustments to the motion work and brakes to keep the tractor running in perfect condition. This particular tractor is unique in terms of Foden D-types, as it was one of the prototypes built by Fodens before the conventional D-type was manufactured. The final D-type incorporated a shortened cab with enclosed sides for the driver and 3 gears, making the tractor more suited to road use, although the engine does not match the speed of a wagon. The D-type has a platform on either side of the engine and also a toolbox. With the driver's position on the left, visibility is poor for seeing other road traffic, and the rear view was almost non-existent on earlier models. But this tractor was one of the first to incorporate a tapered rear water tank. The unusual shape provides better visibility for the driver, particularly when hitching up to trailers. On the rear axle underneath the back, the winding bollard with a long winch rope used originally for hauling out timber has been preserved. The noise within the cab depends upon the gear selected, and like steamrollers and steam engines, it's necessary to stop before changing gear. One of the contributing factors to the overtype's slightly earlier demise in comparison to the undertype steam wagon was the reduced load carrying capacity due to the greater length taken up by the boiler and cab. Steam lorries and wagons transformed goods haulage. For the first time, fast, long-distance road transport became a reality. Although relatively short-lived, the steam wagon played a key role in the commercial development of this and many other nations. Today, the owners and enthusiasts devotedly care for these historic vehicles and work hard to restore them in every detail. For keeping our transport past alive for both educational and pleasure purposes by sharing their wonderful steam machines with us at rallies and road runs, we say thank you.